Hello, kia ora, welcome. Thank you for joining us. We're delighted that you've chosen to learn with us over this next hour about how to master your stakeholder strategy. I'm Russ Horell, Isentia's Chief Revenue Officer, and I'm coming to you from Isentia's Brisbane office on the land of the Turrbal people. I acknowledge their traditional ownership of this land and pay my respects to their elders past and present. It's an absolute privilege for me to host this webinar today. As you know, Isentia is the original media monitoring organization in both Australia and New Zealand, and we continue to evolve our suite of solutions so that we remain the leading provider of partnerships that allow the best comms, PR, policy, and marketing professionals to not just stay informed, but to stay ahead by empowering them to make better decisions. A key pillar to Isentia's success is in our close client relationships, where we make it our priority to understand your challenges and opportunities so that we can be your best partner in navigating them. Another priority and obligation for Isentia is to unite the broad professional community for networking and learning opportunities that aim to lift up the industry and allow you to be even more successful. And that's why we're here today. We know that communications landscape that you are navigating is more difficult than it's ever been before. The era of controlled narratives and predictable news cycles is long gone, as we all know. In its place is a volatile, high stakes environment where a single tweet can spiral into a global crisis, where stakeholder trust is a fragile currency and every action is instantly scrutinized across a fragmented, always on digital world. This climate makes mastering stakeholder strategy an imperative, not an option. Your stakeholders are no longer passive recipients of your messages. They're active media owners and powerful influence brokers who can accelerate your success or ignite your biggest reputational failure. The margin for error is zero, and the cost of misalignment is everything. This webinar aims to empower you with some tactical and practical ways to improve your stakeholder strategy and execution. To facilitate this, we're going to learn together from some of the communications masters across Australia and New Zealand industries. Let me introduce them to you. First, we have Mandy Griffiths. Mandy is the head of stakeholder engagement at the Victorian Department of Families, Fairness and Housing, where she has a dedicated focus on improving communications and engagement for communities facing barriers. Mandy was a founding member of the Victorian Department of Premier and Cabinet's COVID communications team before leading the communications and engagement response for multicultural communities as part of the CALD Communities Task Force, where new channels of engagement and new ways of working were created to improve access to information for all Victorians during that vital time in the pandemic. Mandy is particularly passionate about ways to address and remove discrimination and inequality from our institutions and settings. Thank you for joining us today, Mandy. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Philip Clark. Philip leads Meridian Energy's corporate communications team, overseeing media relations, issues management, internal communications, and communications to support the company's development and construction projects. His team also has strong development capability and manages social media in partnership with the brand team. In addition to his communications leadership, Philip is responsible for assessing and reporting on Meridian's material impacts. He is also leading a 2-year stakeholder research project designed to benchmark and strengthen trust and stakeholder relationships across the company's operations through evidence-based insights. Philip joined Meridian in January 2023 and has more than 25 years experience in communications, both in-house and agency side, working with leading companies in New Zealand, Australia, and the UK. Thank you for joining us today, Philip. And last, but certainly not least, I'm sure someone who many of you already know is Isentia's Director of Insights, Ngaire Crawford. Ngaire is the head of research at Isentia. She has more than 20 years of experience working in communications research and has a passion for understanding how information influences action. Ngaire runs Isentia's public research program, which has a particular focus on representation and diversity in the media. Thank you, Ngaire. So This is how it's going to work today. I'm going to ask a range of questions of Mandy, Phil, and Ngaire, but we want you to be involved too. You'll see a Q&A box in the just to the right of the center of your screen below. Please pose your questions there. We have a large audience, so time permitting, we'll cover as many as we possibly can. We'll also be recording this session and we'll share the link with you in the coming days. So if you need to attend to an urgent matter or if you don't quite capture that inspirational quote from one of our panelists in your notes, we've got you covered. Okay, let's do this. Mandy, I'm coming to you first. Can you tell us about the work that the Victorian Department of Families, Fairness and Housing does and the services it provides to the people of Victoria?
So yeah, the official answer is we're the department responsible for child protection, prevention of family violence, housing, disability, LGBTIQA plus equality, veterans, seniors, and the officers for women and youth. I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but I think I like to think of it more as we're a department working to address inequality and empower communities through a range of programs and services.
Thank you, Mandy. And Phil, now to you. For those who aren't familiar, can you tell us about the work that Meridian does and what it stands for?
Kia ora, Russ. Yeah, Meridian is New Zealand's largest electricity generator and among the largest retailers in the country. We account for about a third of all the electricity generated in New Zealand, all from renewable sources. Like Australia, our market is going through a rapid phase of growth, and so we've got a development pipeline that equates to a total current generation volume. We're also the largest electricity retailer by sales volume and operate the country's second largest EV charging network. Our market is high profile and highly regulated, and I'm pleased to join you from a day in which our government has announced some major reforms to the electricity sector after the latest review. So that's something the team, while I'm doing this, is quite focused on.
Thank you, Phil. Very good timing. Mandy, coming back to you. I want to start with the term stakeholder, which I think is somewhat ubiquitous and often misinterpreted. Can you set the scene for us on what it really means from a professional communications perspective, please?
Sure, and yeah, it is a catch-all term, and I do use it a lot too. I think traditionally it's an individual, group, or organization that is interested in or directly affected by the work that you're doing. But I think people often think of stakeholders as being somewhat on the periphery of what we do. I prefer to think of them as the people who really have a great influence on whether the things that you're working on or decisions you're making are successful or not. That's a good way to think about it. If you're working in government or a large organization, I would say internal stakeholders can sometimes be as important. I know it's weird to think of doing a stakeholder engagement plan for your colleagues or your boss or your decision makers. But I will say every time I have done this, it's always benefited the work that we're doing, and you get a lot more sort of buy-in, champions, and different perspectives. And then externally, of course, it's people interested in or affected by. So it could be community members, for specific communities, community leaders, local council, state or federal government, the media, the funded organisations that you work with. They're really key. We sometimes prefer the term critical friends over stakeholders. I think it sounds a little bit more personal. And we like the term critical because, one, they are really important to the work you're doing, and also they might have different views to you. So it sort of sets those expectations there.
I love that, Mandy. Thank you. And nice segue to Phil. How does Meridian define its stakeholders or critical audiences, and which do you decide? How do you decide which ones to prioritize?
I think Mandy's defined stakeholders pretty well. I mean, at a highest level for me, it's those who impact or who are impacted by our operations. We've got a really diverse and complex stakeholder mix. And so in management for us of stakeholders is the shared responsibility across the business. And it's up to individual teams around projects or assets or business units to define and to manage those relationships. But at the same time, we undertake detailed stakeholder mapping and planning at a project level, at a regional level, and we use that to sort of help us prioritise and focus our efforts. And we've also recently initiated some projects to introduce more structure and more consistency to how we show up as a company.
Thanks, Phil. Now, Ngaire, you have the privilege of working with some of the most elite communications professionals across the globe to measure the effectiveness of their communications and stakeholder strategies. What are the common traits of stakeholder strategies that separate the most successful from your perspective?
Sure. So I think from my vantage point, which is heavily biased to measurement and research, which should be a surprise to no one based on my bio, but there's probably three core characteristics that I think are really valuable for a high performing stakeholder strategy. The first one being that they are evidence based and that they are iterative. So the best way to sum this up is that elite teams don't guess, they measure. So we want to make sure that a baseline is established, so understanding stakeholders before any initiatives are launched, tracking engagement throughout, making sure that there's a level of adaptation depending on what that data says. I've seen organisations achieve quite dramatically different results simply by implementing that regular feedback loop and ensuring that the information isn't static, and making sure that everything's mapping back to changes in behaviour, any kind of trust or reputation scoring that you might be doing. The second really effective thing is that they undertake more radical segmentation. The best strategies move beyond that basic demographic grouping particularly, or trying to put people into really broad groups. Like you could just have customer or industry as broad groups, and using data in a way that plays around with how you segment your stakeholders. So it might be grouping them by communication preferences, their influence networks, and really importantly, by their concerns or their motivations, rather than purely necessarily who they are. So ensuring that you've got a lot of variables mapped to your different levels of segmentation, that's going to allow for really personalized engagement and not so much of a broadcast, which can often happen. And that probably brings to my third and final point, making sure that when you're building out your strategy, how you're going to measure that strategy, that you are building for listening, not just broadcasting. So you have to allocate a level of resource to ensuring that you're capturing stakeholder sentiment and feedback, ensuring that you're building those two-way dialogue channels, and really importantly, closing the feedback loop by demonstrating back to stakeholders how you've used their information. So ensuring that they can see the direct impact that they've had. We know that stakeholders who feel heard are the ones that are most likely to become advocates, even when they don't get everything that they want. But the fact that they feel that they're part of a process where listening and action happens is really the most important thing. So I guess the big thread in there is that stakeholder engagement does need to be considered and have the same rigor as financial management or product development, not sort of positioned as the sometimes peripheral communications activity.
Thank you, Ngaire. Mandy, back to you. We read each year collectively in the Edelman Trust Barometer about declining trust in governments and institutions in general. What do you think are some of the keys to overcoming this declining trust through stakeholder engagement?
Been really interesting and unfortunate to watch that we are moving from a high trust society to a low trust society, which does mean there's a lot more suspicion from the public, perception that processes are slow and opaque and subject to manipulation. One of the alarming stats I saw was that the majority of people in Australia believe that leaders in government, business and the media, they believe that they lie or deliberately mislead the public. So that is a really tough place to start from when you're looking at engagements. But I also would say this is why it's so much more important to do, because otherwise it's just going to get worse and worse. I think Ngaire covered a lot of what I was going to mention too about trust around just the importance of actually going through the process of engagement. I think often when we feel we can't deliver what stakeholders want, if we know there's not necessarily extra funding that we can provide or extra things, it's better not to talk to them so they won't be disappointed. But it's really the opposite. When you don't have what they exactly need, it's so much more important to do that engagement work, because people want to be heard, and that trust will be built when they feel that you have listened, that you do understand what they're going through and what they need, and that they are sort of contributing to the solution, even if it's not the exact thing that they are asking for. So yes, as Ngaire said, this needs to be resourced, and there is time and cost to doing this work. But I think one argument you can put up if you're looking to kind of get more investment in this area is what is the cost of not doing it? And the cost is declining trust, issues and conflicts are harder to resolve, and you're also just spending a lot of time and resources on things that aren't meeting the needs of your stakeholders. So yes, keys to the question, I'll go back to that, keys to overcoming this. I think it's really building that culture of recognizing stakeholders as assets, not as problems that you need to manage. You build the relationships before a crisis happens. This can be through formal ways like advisory groups, working groups, or more informal ways, just like attending events where your stakeholders will be and catching up for coffees. It doesn't have to be too in-depth. Expanding your familiarity and awareness is really important on kind of both sides, yours and theirs. And this means a lot of training that you can provide, both for the people who are doing the engagement. This is a learned skill, even if you have experience in other areas, how to build trust with the community and engage properly is something you need to kind of dedicate time to. And also offer insights for your stakeholders and training about how your institution works. So you can create that sort of reduce the power imbalance for one, and then create meaningful engagement. Often the people who don't understand our corporate language or the technicalities of how we deliver programs, their views can get overlooked or ignored, even though they're the people who are directly being impacted. So how can we support them to better be able to listen to what they're saying? Also, training in cultural competency, I think, is really important. Australians are diverse, and it's really important how we can be as accessible and inclusive as possible. So it's a safe space for everyone. And just, making sure that you are spending time on communication engagement strategies. And I do say communication as well, because it is important. You could have communication without engagement, but you can't have engagement without communication. And just a note on that is reducing the barriers for people to understand what you're doing is writing in plain language. That's a big thing that we're focusing on at the moment. Too much. I think the average reading level of things online are at grade 12 reading level. Pretty much almost half of Australians, no matter their sort of backgrounds, aren't reading at that level. So we're being quite exclusionary. So yeah, plain language is a really good thing to invest in.
Thank you, Mandy. Phil, we mentioned in your bio that Meridian has embarked on research that aims to provide a baseline of data on how the organization is perceived. Can you tell us broadly how you're going about it and why you believe it's important?
Yeah, thanks, Russ. Yeah, as I said at the outset, stakeholder management is a devolved function at Meridian. So there's teams as diverse as our customer account managers to development managers and communities and people around our assets and all those sorts of things. And so, for me, there was a kind of need for us, given where we're at, building more than we've ever built before and entering into JVs more than we have before, having a change of government, to move to a space of being far more evidence-led. And so I was really fortunate to get good support across the business and end up with a project that's being funded by 4 different business units. And so we are midway through a 2-year project where we are using a sample of 500 stakeholders. It's a mix of qual and quant research. It's effectively an organisational 360, excluding staff, for where we have different research. So it's everything from the communities around assets and communities around development to government at all levels, mana whenua, our supply chain joint venture partners, media, investors, everything. It's big enough of a sample for us to get data breakdowns for each of those stakeholder groups. We're getting really good insights, not just into how we're perceived and how much we're trusted, what people expect from us, how well we're delivering on that. We're getting some really good insights into what drives trust, which is giving teams effectively a cheat sheet for what they need to do to build trust among their stakeholders. So there's some really powerful data that's coming through, even at this point where we are. So I say to everyone at Meridian, it's not 2 1-year studies, it's 1 2-year studies. So we're building towards an ultimate sample. But even at the midway point, there's some really good insights coming through, and it's extremely well received. The kind of why is we just wanted to know how we were perceived and how trusted and what people wanted and what we were delivering. But more fundamentally, I was really driven to move us to being in a position to have an evidence-led approach to stakeholder engagement. And for a company we've been building wind farms, for instance, for about 25 years. And when you build wind farms, you're having the same conversations around the same concerns that you've always had. You can't remove the personal aspects to it, but we didn't have an ability to quantify the lived experience so that you can just mitigate concerns around shadow flicker or noise or whatever it happens to be. And so pulling a lot of that insights through is really valuable to us.
Thank you, Phil. Ngaire, back to you. I'm interested, if you were building a stakeholder engagement playbook from scratch, what are the 3 essentials that you would include?
I think for 3 essentials, one of the things that's incredibly important is a level of dynamism, for lack of a better term. I think what is quite easy to do with stakeholder research particularly, which is why it's good to hear Phil talk about the data that he's already seeing. They can often be a very static exercise. There's something that's done annually, and what really will build out the best data and allow you to move and shift is something that is more of a living system. So something that continually gathers and updates stakeholder data. This might include tracking positions, monitoring public statements in social media, understanding networks and influence patterns, and really, really crucially being able to start recording your own interactions with an organisation. So particularly starting to turn some of that activity into data and ensuring that lives and breathes as you communicate is really, really important. The other one is, I think, something probably a lot of people have heard me talk about before, which is ensuring that all of your objectives are tied to things that are measurable outcomes. So I have seen so many strategies that list stakeholders and tactics without actually defining what that success looks like. So it needs to be something that understands and defines what do we want each stakeholder group to know and feel and do, how we're going to measure that progress, what are those leading and lagging indicators, forcing a bit more discipline around outcomes over outputs. So instead of the activity itself being the win in terms of like maybe you conducted quarterly stakeholder briefings, the objective is more around, how do we increase stakeholder understanding of our sustainability commitments from 40% to 65% as measured by quarterly surveys or whatever it is that you might be choosing to do. And I think the third one is really ensuring that you're not forgetting your crisis and issues protocols when it comes to your stakeholder planning and mapping, because obviously, nothing is perfect and issues are going to emerge, but ensuring those incredibly clear escalation paths, any kind of pre-approved statements, ensuring that you've got really clearly defined roles for crisis stakeholder engagement, ensuring you know how you're going to accelerate any listening during that time, ensuring that feedback loop can become really rapid and shift as it needs to. I think particularly that really allows you to limit that response window so that you can move that detection to response time zone down a little bit. So really, I think it's trying to create a system, and I say system quite loosely, but ensuring that you're getting the information that you need to be able to make decisions. It needs to be strategic. You need to be able to measure that strategy effectively, and it needs to be resilient, because ultimately everything changes very quickly. People change, information changes, day-to-day things move quite rapidly. So ensuring that resilience is built into it is really important as well.
Thank you, Ngaire. Mandy, you led the communications and engagement for the Cal Communities Task Force for the Victorian Department of Premier and Cabinet during the pandemic, which I reckon on a list of the most challenging stakeholder management situations in the history of the communications profession would legitimately be very close to the top. Can you please paint a picture for us of what that was like?
That's for sure. And I know pandemic talk can be quite triggering for people, so I'll try not to focus on that part too much. But yeah, it was a very interesting time, and a lot of people played a really important role there. But I think Just for some background, the Coal Communities Task Force was set up in August 2020. That was when Melbourne was going through our second wave. We're the only one in Australia. And we understood at that point the multicultural communities were being disproportionately impacted. We don't always get budget for communications and engagement evaluation. I don't know, it'd be great if we did. But for this particular case, we were able to see in real time whether what we're doing was working or not. The information was changing really quickly. It was that crisis situation, so we could see what was resonating and what wasn't. And I think there's some key things that we did at that time that, anxiety was high, trust was low, there was a lot of stress and confusion. There were some things that we did that I think long-term really helped rebuild our relationships with the multicultural communities and get a much better outcome. The first thing was that I think we just recognized that we didn't have all the answers. We didn't have to come in as that authoritarian, this is how it is and this is what we're doing. We were humbled a little bit because we could see, some of the stuff we were doing wasn't resonating. And it's okay to ask the community what they need and then work out how we can best achieve that. And so many times I have to say we went in thinking we knew what the biggest pain points or the biggest challenges were, and it turned out to be something else entirely. So without that kind of time we invested in talking to the community, we could have been spending it on things that would have so much time on just the wrong things. And related to this one, learning was that people really wanted to be involved. They want to be part of the solutions to things that impact them. I will say absolutely we believe you should recognise people for their time, and community expertise is expertise and should be recognised and remunerated in that way. But I will say, you'll always find willing participants to help solve the things that impact them. One thing I think really benefited us at that time, though, was that we had absolute buy-in from the top. So from the Premier down, the Minister for Multicultural Affairs, the Chief Health Officer and his officers, they really prioritised talking to this stakeholder group, attending meetings, not all meetings, but key ones. And people really responded to that. I think hierarchy really does matter in building trust. If they're seeing the people on TV coming to the session to talk to them as well, they feel acknowledged and heard. Just on the flip side, I was in a different emergency situation at another time where the senior person was supposed to come to a community leader session and forgot and didn't show. And it was during an emergency, so people were really high stress emotionally and physically. And you can imagine how that went down. So please don't do that. That actual prioritizing from the top made a huge difference. And another thing that we kind of finally want to say is there's a motto that we use sometimes, which is never waste a crisis. No one wants a crisis, but if you're in one, don't waste it. And I think we were at a point where not doing anything was riskier than doing new things. So we were able to look at different ways that we could do things that we hadn't done before. So for one example, we set up a WhatsApp community leaders group for a lot of the community leaders in metropolitan Melbourne and multicultural communities. So it was an invitation only group, but it was just a completely open discussion. Anyone could post, anyone could share. And we did that to sort of help the community leaders, I think, hear from their peers, people facing other challenges. They could provide advice and support. It was a way for us to reach them really quickly when there was breaking news. We could send things in plain language that they could send off to their other work WhatsApp groups and translate information. And it's just this group, breaking news, all that kind of stuff. It's really easy for them to share through WhatsApp. That was one common channel that we realized many communities use. And that group is actually still running today, 5 years later, which is pretty incredible. And that's just been a lovely self-sustaining group since then. But in normal times, that might have been a bit risky to set up. But yeah, now we've got proof and we can build on it. And I think the things that we did in those 2 years progressed us about a decade's worth in our understanding of the importance of engagement. Now the question is how we sort of capture that. And I want to do a little plug in that from a communications perspective, we did create a better practice guide for multicultural communications, which is available if you're interested in that. And soon we're actually working on the moment a better practice guide for inclusive engagement, which will be released later this month. So hopefully that will be something useful for people to use as well. Learn from our lessons.
Thank you so much, Mandy. There's some amazing answers coming through here to my questions. Just a reminder to everybody, there's a Q&A button down the bottom there. So please fire your questions through, and I'll pose them to our amazing panel. There is a great comment that came through from an anonymous attendee a little bit earlier, saying that they agreed with Mandy, plain language and dot point comms for best impact when it comes to AEO. So a big thumbs up for you there, Mandy, on that point. My next question goes back to Phil. Phil, acknowledging how important we've discussed stakeholder engagement is, how do you influence the way other teams in your organizations work with stakeholders?
Well, Russ, the research certainly helps. I'll say that. But another thing that we've done is create a stakeholder engagement framework for other teams across the business to use. We're not compelling them to use it. We're not taking responsibility for what they do. We're simply offering guidance and having a conversation about best practice and consistency. Some aspects of the framework are well embedded in the business already. Some won't apply to all parts of the business. Not every team with every type of stakeholders needs to do stakeholder mapping, for instance. But it is a really good conversation starter, and it's a good way to drive influence. The framework that we've developed has 4 pillars to it. The first is about behaviours. We've got existing engagement guidelines, and we've got our company values, and we've got a code of practice, so that bundles existing things, and they're quite well embedded. The second is about planning, so that's stakeholder mapping, and it's annual plans. In some cases, we do regional plans. The third is about engagement and how that shapes up. So we are promoting some consistent use of channels and tactics. We're also looking at how we track contact and sentiment. There's no sophisticated CRM in place at Meridian. What we've got is our team is driving one little prototype within our development team. The generation team is trialing another one, and it's one where when you're working through influence, you've just got to take a step back, let people be innovative and test things, and then we'll see how they go and where we've got a best solution, and we'll try and take one more broadly from there. And then the final pillar is around evaluation and evolution. And so that's about picking up the insights from the research that we've got underway and other insights that we can capture, and using that to kind of adapt and evolve as we go. Within that kind of planning space, one of the things that we've started doing is developing regional comms and engagement plans, which I mentioned earlier. They're quite significant for us. That it's fine to have stakeholder management devolved across your organisation. It gets tricky where you've got overlap in where those stakeholders operate. And so for us as a company, we've got a lot of generation assets that we've had for a long, long time. Our oldest is almost 100 years old. And so we've got some really well-established communities, but there is such a massive amount of new build going on in electricity in New Zealand. So we've got new development projects being scoped in almost every region in New Zealand. And so what we've started doing is identifying the regions where we've got multiple assets or developments, and then getting teams together to have a plan, a good conversation, do the stakeholder mapping, come up with a plan, look at how everyone shares roles and responsibilities. And the next one we're doing, we've got a workshop next week, which is Manawatu in the Lower North Island. We've got 2 operational assets, a consented project, and about another 4 that we're looking through development. So that's a really complex stakeholder mix for us. So those plans it's a good way of bringing teams together and having a good conversation around collaboration. I'm also really lucky that there's some complementary work streams that I lead. So you talked at the start of my bio about materiality assessment. That's all about stakeholders, and it's all about impact. And we also manage in our team some aspects of our DJSI submissions around materiality and around stakeholders. So those projects touch the same people that we want to talk to around the research project and that we want to talk to about the framework. So you've got multiple work streams with lots of complementary conversations. And in my experience, if you are talking to people and you can offer insights and you're offering assistance, that's always going to open doors.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you to the brave attendees who are starting to send some great questions through. I might ask a couple of more of our panelists, and then start to bring some audience questions in. I wanted to go to Ngaire next around the hurdles that you've seen organisations stumble over in stakeholder mapping or engagement. What would you warn them about avoiding with their stakeholder strategy or execution?
Sure. I feel like I'm often a warning system. Probably the first one is what I was mentioning earlier around ensuring that things are dynamic. It's really easy to fall into kind of a static metric syndrome. So particularly investing really heavily into an initial stakeholder mapping exercise, you're going to create really, beautiful matrices with interest grids, and you might use it for a little bit, something's going to change, and then it gets filed away. So it is this idea that you need to be very active in your different stakeholder landscapes, if that's internal or external, and ensuring that that's built into the basics in terms of how often is this going to be updated, how are we going to continue to add information in here. And I think in a similar vein, the other big thing to avoid is ensuring that you are not operating in an echo chamber. Even in stakeholder strategy and measurement, it's incredibly easy to just gravitate towards stakeholders who are the easiest to reach and who are the most supportive. When really we know that it's actually those most critical stakeholders or critical friends that are going to really give you the information that will help you move, and particularly the quiet middle. So those who haven't necessarily formed strong opinions yet. I've watched teams invest, 80% of their effort on 20% who already support them, and that's going to neglect those persuadables. And leaving critics unchallenged to shape a narrative that makes sense to them. So ensuring that you are building things into ensuring that you don't have this level of echo chamber, and that you're specifically building that so that you can resource that outreach to skeptical and neutral stakeholders as well.
Thank you, Ngaire. There's a great question that's come through from Meredith Cook in the audience that touches on an area that I wanted to ask you about, Mandy. And Meredith asks, can you talk about implementing and using CRM, which are often referred to as SRM, as in Stakeholder Relationship Management tools or systems? What are the mistakes that most organizations make when purchasing or implementing a CRM/SRM? And more broadly, what part do the tools of the trade play in ensuring that you can manage stakeholders effectively and also showcase the effort that it requires?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And I think probably the biggest mistake I've seen is that people go to all the effort of sort of putting this in place and then not using it. I think the implementation part of it is really important, not just the setting up. And I think, if a tool's not used or shared and actively used, it's not going to be as valuable. So I think it's really investing that time. And I think acknowledging that you need to invest the time for stakeholders as well. There's a saying in our department that we use, which is, we're not the circus. We're not here for just 1 week only. We'll listen to you and then we'll disappear forever. That's not gonna build trust. So I think it's that, just putting in the time to set something up properly, have, as Ngaire mentioned, all those kind of elements, identifying, not just filling in the boxes, but how do people prefer to be engaged, particularly for those harder to reach people? Is it out of hours? Is it by phone call instead of email? There's a lot of communities prefer oral communication than written communication. And who else is talking to them? Over consultation is a huge problem. And this, without using kind of these tools and actively updating them, you might be getting to that point where people start to disengage because they're overwhelmed, or they're telling you the same things they've already told someone else in a different area. And no one has time for that kind of duplication. So I think it's just the active use of this that's the most important thing. It's setting aside the time to fill it out, to update it. And then I think proving its value is probably the big part, so we can continue to invest in that time. And that's reporting up. And I love the power of a quote. It doesn't have to be all standard, just the quotes that people say or they send through, and being able to send that up to other stakeholders in your organization. What's happening? What are people saying? You're really demonstrating the value. So it's making sure that tool is just not sitting on an island by itself, but it's visible in many ways to people across the organization.
Thanks, Mandy. Back to you, Phil. Can you share with us an example of where you've turned a key stakeholder or an important set of stakeholders around?
I can, but before I do, just to add to what Mandy said, that around CRM, that for us at Meridian now, it is like the process that we're going through is using really, really rudimentary tools. So, like literally things we built in Excel spreadsheets to, because what we want to test first is whether people will do it, and see if we can build the use of it and show the value of it. So then we get a business cases to invest in an expensive CRM tool. Your question around difficult stakeholders, yeah, I thought I'd go back in time a little bit, and I thought it might be useful to use a media example. But this is an example that's kind of shaped my kind of views and sort of stuck with me over the years, and it's one that's kind of shaping the approach that we're taking to a difficult interest group at the moment at Meridian. In a former life, I was the PR and media manager on the Cricket World Cup 2015 in New Zealand and the New Zealand side of it. And a year out from the tournament, we had a difficult relationship with TVNZ, which for Australians is one of the biggest media outlets in New Zealand. It wasn't that it was any friction, it was just that we weren't getting the outcomes we were getting from other media. And the thing for me in my first major event was you just got to kind of expect in the early days that things would happen because it's a World Cup, right? So, and in major events, and this really has stuck with me and shaped the way that I work, is that there's no second chances in major events. You've got to get it 100%. And so that kind of philosophy, even though you can do things, get second chances sometimes in electricity. Anyway, so upshot is we had to work it out, and we did work it out. And ultimately, it came down to 5 things, which, as I said, kind of stick with me. The first is optimism, that it really helps that you believe that by making an effort, you can make it better, as opposed to sitting back and accepting that it's difficult and it's not. The second thing is to take a step back and take time to better understand the organisation, how's it structured, who's responsible for what, who is making the decisions. Thirdly, to invest time in building those relationships, and in doing that, to start by listening and understanding how you can help them. And then fourth, finding opportunities to deliver on that and to build trust. And sometimes that requires a bit of patience. And then finally, taking time to nurture relationships that you've established and use those to open more doors in the organisation. And so what we've got at the moment with an interest group is, we had really good support around a specific project in one region of New Zealand, but when it came to the planning process, we got strong opposition. And, that for me looked like a situation where the decision in that organisation wasn't made by the people we were dealing with, and we didn't really understand them that well. So we're kind of going through those steps of having the confidence to believe we can make it better, but going, how do we better understand them, and how do we just restart and rebuild?
Thank you, Phil. And we should talk about that SRM once you've built the internal business case, because that's like a world-leading stakeholder relationship management tool that, if anybody's interested, we'd love to show it to you. Ngaire, I'm going to come to you for my kind of final question, and then we'll go to a range of questions that have come through from the audience that are all great. Ngaire, my question is, given the rise of misinformation and the proliferation of AI generated synthetic content, how do you think professional communicators should be thinking about evolving their approach to stakeholder engagement?
Misinformation and AI is such an interesting topic. I think the biggest thing to firstly acknowledge is that we now operate in an environment where information is just going to be persistently contested. So it's not a problem that can necessarily be solved, but it is very much a condition that can be managed to some extent. I think the big thing for people to consider is that the approach of setting the record straight does not work in an environment where false narratives can kind of be infinitely generated. So there's 2 big things that are of importance here. One is really around the verification and transparency of information. and that becoming core to to the communications and stakeholder approach. So stakeholders are increasingly sophisticated and skeptical. By all rights, they should be. And ultimately, communications needs to make it really easy for stakeholders to verify information. So clear sourcing, linking to primary documents, being really transparent about methodologies. And one of the things that does appear to be effective in this preemptive strategy is debunking potential false or misinformation narratives. So using what may be a narrative that could come up in a particular setting to inoculate stakeholders a little bit about expected misinformation, because what that allows you to do is put it out there through your own framing, and then it will come back to them and they'll recognize it as a false narrative rather than necessarily it coming to them new. And the other element to that is just ensuring that your engagement moves to continuous relationship building rather than periodic engagement. So the most effective tactic against misinformation that we can see in all of the research that's coming through on it now is building out your advocates and your chorus, because it is ultimately how you replace narratives than how you combat them directly. So the more that you can communicate a message strongly through multiple sources is going to be more effective to replace what other narratives may be out there in public, rather than necessarily going down the line of trying to correct a piece of information that may have already, that horse may have already bolted.
Excellent. Thank you, Ngaire. Now to some questions from the audience, as I mentioned. So the first one I want to go to is a question from Annabelle Lee. Thank you for the question, Annabelle. Annabelle acknowledges the great guidance of the panel so far, and she states that she's from a micro government agency that's taking the step of creating a stakeholder engagement framework. And Annabelle asks, what do you suggest are the non-negotiable elements for a framework? Mandy, I might pass it on to you first, but Phil and Ngaire, please feel free to add to it after Mandy finishes.
I can kick it off. I think the first thing is like, what are your principles of engagement? Like, how are you going to approach engagement? How are you going to treat the stakeholders? And, how are you going to make sure that it's kind of effective use of their time as well as yours? And I think that's, really building that kind of respectfulness within that. And I think that goes back to what Ngaire was saying before about that constant feedback loop, that two-way channel, how you're going to report back, because people do get frustrated if they're constantly telling you things and they don't see where it goes or what happens to it. So I think it's that principal guidance. How are you going to interact with your stakeholders and make sure that it's a really valuable relationship for both sides of you? I'm sure the other panelist has other things they can add to that.
Do you want to stab at that, Phil or Ngaire, or has Mandy's
No,
nailed it?
Mandy's right. I mean, behaviours are really fundamental. I think getting some structure around it is equally important. Whether you might not need to do stakeholder mapping, but having a basic plan in place, having some structure around reporting and feedback, those sorts of things are all really, really critical.
I would only ever add, make sure that you can measure it. The biggest question to always ask in there is, how will you know if it's working?
Thank you, Ngaire. And that's a good segue into a next question, which I'll go to you on first, which comes through anonymously and calls out that it's a tough question. And it states that if you had to, what's the one thing you'd measure to show influence in media / stakeholder strategy? For example, this single KPI.
It's different depending on what the outcome is that you're trying to achieve. From a media perspective, the thing that I find to be the most valuable, particularly if you are reporting to internal stakeholders, is the impact that your activity and your thought processes have had on media content. That's one thing. With audiences directly, I think it's a harder question in that you do need to try and determine what it is that you want out of them in the first place. If ultimately your core magic metric, for lack of a better term, is trust, reputation, or behaviour change. You sort of have to find that and then build back from there in terms of what that might look like. I think I often get asked, like, what is the one thing or the one metric? And the unfortunate answer is that there isn't one. But there is often one singular impactful objective or goal. So as long as there's that, there might be 400 metrics that build underneath it, but it's being able to demonstrate that that one strategy or goal was effective is really, really the way to look at it, rather than trying to do one for one in terms of data points.
Yeah, and Weena Morris also asks a very similar question to that around it, and she gives you a little bit more opportunity to pick more than just one there. But what are the useful metrics to track and measure success in stakeholder engagement? Which I think you've covered nicely there, Ngaire. Did Phil or Mandy, did you have anything to add to that one?
I mean, I think that it helps if, like me, you're blessed with a massive research project, right? So if you've got a wealth of data and a wealth of metrics, you can choose from it, and that's really great. But if you don't have that, I think you need to start by looking at what you can measure and then understanding what's most relevant. So it's got to be a bit of a horses for courses thing. So yes, if you've got access to a wealth of data, that's great. But if you don't, there's still things that you can do.
I think the starting point is very much like, just if you can start to measure your activity, what are you doing right now? How do you turn that activity into data? That's very much that first step if anyone's looking for a first step.
I'd say at the end point, I think measuring, how many of the stakeholders turn out to be champions for the project or decision that you end up with. I think even if maybe it's not exactly what they were looking for, if it's something they can speak to confidently and share with their communities, I think that's just always a really good outcome of the stakeholder journey.
Thanks, guys. There's another interesting one that's come through anonymously, directed at you, Phil, here, that says that you mentioned wide cross-function support for the stakeholder strategy. Outside of comms, what are the other functions that had the most buy-in, and were there any surprises there for you?
Well, there's a simple answer to that, but I'll tell it in a longer way. I mean, the first kind of step for me was the first thing I did was develop a discussion paper of a couple of pages and went around and spoke with all of the different stakeholders, owners around the business, so maybe 15 people. And that wasn't a conversation about money, it was a conversation about opportunity, and everyone supported it. And then there became a conversation about money. And so what I did was target the three other teams who were most likely to benefit the most, and got the first one across the line. And then you've got, with yourself, you've got two, and got them into line. So what it means, so the ones who use it most are the biggest fans, are the ones that are helping to pay for it. But thankfully, that is our generation team, which has all the assets, and it's our development team, which is doing all the new build, and it's the retail team, which has all the customers.
Thank you, Phil. There's a really great question that's come through from Karen Quincy. And Karen says that we've gone through a major stakeholder mapping project for a significant multi-year project. However, since this work was completed, nothing has been done with it. And when our comms team attempts to engage the upper management about sharing more information or being more transparent with our stakeholders, we find our expertise is ignored. What advice do you have on better getting upper management on board to support improved stakeholder management or engagement? Do you want to start that, Phil?
You need to find a champion. Look, we've got a situation where I talked about regional plans before. We're onto our second, and the first one we did has been developed but not implemented. And we're not holding the pen on that as corporate comms. It's another part of the business unit. And so it's really a question of, okay, it's stuck a bit, how do we get it going? And so there's two things that we're doing. And one is just simply we are re-engaging with that team to just have another session and just reignite the conversation. We've also found a champion in a parallel team who's got some interest. And we're looking back and going, right, who's a more senior champion that we can drive for this? And so it's like a lot of influence in organizations. You need to find your champions and build relationships and work them hard, and keep, as I said before, just be optimistic. believe that you can make it better and find ways to do that.
Thank you, Phil. I've got another great question that's come through from an attendee, Siobhan Butler, and I might address this to you, Mandy, if I may. Siobhan says, do you have any tips on developing a stakeholder strategy that is not project specific, that is not an engagement strategy for a program of work? For example, in the health system that Siobhan works with industrial bodies across tens and hundreds of programs, projects, how would you recommend going about developing a stakeholder strategy that isn't about those specific projects, but about the entire stakeholder and the relationship?
I think for this, if you have very specific stakeholders in mind, I think setting up an advisory group or a working group with those people, so you're building those relationships sort of before you need them, before you know what kind of you might want to consult them about, is a really effective way of doing that. So you do all the groundwork while you have time, you get everyone, the right people together, the terms of reference of how it will work in a way that works for everyone, build those relationships and your understanding of sort of their needs and what they're working with. And then when things come up, and then you can kind of be the caretakers of that group, so that when people say, oh, we're doing this thing, we'd like great to test that with some people, you're like, you can come to our next meeting, and it's really efficient, kind of formalized in a way that benefits the stakeholders as well. It's often something they can put on their resume, that they can speak about, put on LinkedIn and give them credibility. So it's just a nice mutual beneficial way of kind of having that ongoing stakeholder engagement.
Thank you, Mandy. As suspected, there's some great questions coming through, and more than we have the time to answer today. I'm going to ask one more audience question, and then ask a closing question about panelists, and make sure we get everybody back to their important stakeholder management on the hour. This is a good one for you, Ngaire. This comes from an anonymous attendee, and it states, how quickly can media monitoring detect changes in community sentiment, and how responsive can the reporting be to the client, and can changes outside set parameters that reflect significant triggers in plans be conveyed promptly to a client?
Anonymous, that is quite a question. But actually, yes, I think one of the things that people forget about the role of AI, particularly in generating content, is it also helps you analyze content much faster. It also helps you track patterns much faster than was previously possible. Actually, again, this does come back a little bit to that overarching goal. So if that is a reputational structure, if that is a strategy, if that is a crisis management plan, it's ensuring that everything else you've got, if that's media monitoring, if that's social listening, if that's reputational surveys, are all linking back in the same way, because that means that that pattern recognition that you need to understand changes in community sentiment, if that's via particular subreddits, if that's via a particular CRM system, if it's through organizational listening, ensuring that all of that data is structured in the right way, that it is what the drivers of negativity are and the drivers of positivity are, having all of that mapped appropriate to the data set. That is what allows you to do that very quickly. And I wouldn't say in real time, because effectively, to do this kind of thing effectively, you want a level of checks and balances in it, so that you're not sort of flying off every time something goes up or down. But ensuring that that's built does mean that it's actually it is much, much quicker than I think people have necessarily experienced before.
Thank you, Ngaire. So my final question to each of our amazing panelists is that if you could give one piece of advice to a comms professional just starting out in stakeholder engagement today, what would that be? We might go to Mandy first, followed by Phil, and finally Ngaire.
Just don't be scared to engage. I think if you approach things genuinely and authentically, and I think just ask how people want to be engaged with and how they want to work, people appreciate that, and they will tell you, and they want to engage you. They want to have their voices heard. So I think, don't be scared of it. And I think the more you do it, the more you'll see the benefit of it. And it's a really good thing to just start your career with, both internally and externally. Talking to people gets you very far. And listening.
How about you, Phil? What's your advice?
My advice is to adopt a growth mindset when it comes to your influence. In most cases, to influence outside your organisation, you need to influence within your organisation. Not everyone has great influence. It can be a hard thing to develop. So my advice is to take it seriously, study it, learn from others, reflect on your success, keep growing.
Bring us home, Ngaire.
I'm going to encourage everyone to be the most annoying person in every planning meeting, every strategy discussion, and ask 2 questions constantly. Why are we doing this? How will we know if this worked or is working? Those 2 questions, if it's about stakeholders, if it's about media, if it's about audience, if it's about communication in any way, those 2 questions will serve you incredibly well. You may not be well liked in those meetings, but eventually everyone else in the meeting is going to start answering the question for you as well.
Thank you, Ngaire, and thank you so much to Mandy and Phil. I've certainly learned a lot today in the last hour, and I hope that all of our attendees have as well. As I said at the start, we'll share the recording of this and enjoy the rest of your day.